Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to a new online event within the European Meteorological Society webinar series. In this occasion, we present a critical global challenge, which is the challenge of achieving net zero emissions. As the meteorological community plays a core role in advancing scientific knowledge, in informing policy and driving sustainable solutions, past year, the EMS made a pledge to become net zero by year 2040. Before introducing our speaker today, let me recall some practical hints. This webinar is being recorded and will be published later on in the EMS YouTube channel. Please use the chat to write your questions, which will be answered only at the end of the presentation. Vesna Juricic will organize group if needed and read the questions at the end on this chat. And also, as always, please send your suggestions of possible topics and speaker to us. Whatever topic you consider could be interesting or attractive, I'm sure it could fit in this format. And now, let me introduce you to our presenter today, who is Professor Liz Bentley, the President of the EMS. In her presentation titled EMS Journey to Net Zero, she will explore the EMS commitment to the net zero transition, highlighting the key strategies, challenges, and opportunities in this journey. The session will discuss the role of meteorological research in climate mitigation, adaptation, and decision-making, as well as initiatives within EMS to reduce its own carbon footprint. Go ahead, Liz, and welcome with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ernesto, and welcome everybody. As Ernesto said, I've been asked to present on the net zero journey of the EMS, and I'm delighted to be able to do that today. So we know within our community that climate change poses a significant threat to us and the world around us. And we know that as an environmental organization, we have a key role to play in reducing those carbon emissions. So the EMS has been discussing this now for a few years. We have had discussions at our annual General Assembly, which brings all the member societies from across Europe together. And we will talk today about those discussions and the outcome of those discussions. We feel that the EMS has a responsibility to take a leadership role in this particular area of becoming net zero. And there was unanimous support across everybody across Europe that we should take an active role in this. So my talk is going to split into 5 sections. I'm going to start by talking about what net zero is, so that we're all aware what we're talking about. I'm going to bring that to life by looking at a case study from the Royal Meteorological Society, which is where I also work, and I can take you on our net zero journey to give you some examples just to help to understand where that journey comes from. And then the last 3 sections will focus on the EMS. So we'll look at some of the emission data that we've been collecting at the EMS. We'll talk about the pledge that Ernesto mentioned a minute ago, and we'll also look at our transition plan to get us to net zero. So I'm going to start with what net zero is, and I decided to use this graphic to help us to do that. So on the left-hand side of this graphic, you can see examples of where we as humans emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the examples shown here are from transportation, maybe generating electricity, from industrial practices where we burn fossil fuels. And when we can balance or reduce those greenhouse gas emissions to as small amount as possible, we then try and balance with greenhouse gas removal from the atmosphere. As humans, we have opportunities to remove greenhouse gases through nature-based solutions, so planting trees, for example, but also through technical solutions, such as carbon capture and storage. And if we can get those two in balance, then we have met net zero. So this is the definition. And we're going to talk today about how we break down calculating those emissions on the left-hand side. You can see at the bottom now of this slide, I've detailed the different greenhouse gases that we try and measure and report. So carbon dioxide is clearly one of the main gases from burning fossil fuels, but we also have methane from agricultural practices and our dietary decisions, for example, and a whole host of other greenhouse gases that you can see in the circles of this graphic. We then split the emissions that we as humans generate into three sections, three scopes, and I'll talk about those now in more detail. So the pink bar is called Scope 1, and this is basically where an organization burns fossil fuels or directly produces greenhouse gases through things like having a gas boiler to generate heat for a building, burning petrol or diesel in company vehicles to transport products around, for example, or in chemical processes in making products. The second scope, the grey bar, the grey arrow, focuses on the greenhouse gases that are produced in generating electricity. The electricity that we use in our houses and in our businesses, we need to also capture the amount of emissions from generating those electricity. And both scopes 1 and 2, we have direct influence on how much emissions we generate from those activities. We can make decisions, conscious decisions, to reduce the amount of emissions from those two activities. The blue areas, the blue arrows that you can see, are called Scope 3, and they're divided into two sections, but there are 15 categories under Scope 3, and these are often the much more challenging areas where we have to reduce our carbon emissions, because we have no direct influence on making changes to these. Quite often we're in the hands of our suppliers, organizations that we work with, and their emissions. And so it is a little bit more challenging to look at the Scope 3 emissions. So we'll talk about where the EMS has been capturing data under these emissions in a minute. But as I said at the beginning, I'd like to just give you a case study to help bring some of this technical definitions and so forth to life by looking at the work that we've been doing at the Royal Meteorological Society over the last few years. So here is a net zero example, and I will introduce you a little bit to the Royal Met Society. So we're the UK's Meteorological Society. We're based in Reading, and you can see a picture on the right hand side. This is our headquarters. We own this building in Reading. It's a listed building, so it has historical interest, which makes it a little bit more challenging to get planning application to do changes to the building to make it more efficient and a sustainable building. But we don't have any other buildings that we own or lease, so it's quite, in a sense, quite simple. We just have one building that we need to focus on. The Royal Met Society, like many other Met Societies across Europe, has members and volunteers, but I think different to a number of Met Societies across Europe, we also employ a number of people. So I currently have 21 employees. Most of them work within this building in the Society. And the previous example that I showed had lots of information that was probably more relevant to industrial organizations that produce products, for example, and sell products. I describe as much more as facilitators. We deliver lots of services. So we have people doing things rather than producing products and selling those products. So let's go through the journey and we'll start with those scopes 1 and 2, the two that are internal to the organization that we had more influence over. And we can go back 15 years actually to 2010. The Society did an energy efficiency audit on the building that I've just shown you. And we made some changes at the time, quite small changes really, so transferring to using LED lights, which are quite commonplace now, but certainly weren't back in 2010. And also ensuring we turned off electrical equipment when it wasn't in use. So some quite simple steps, but we made quite a quick reduction, a 10% reduction in our carbon emissions by making some changes. From that audit, it was recommended that the Society should install solar panels on the roof. So in 2012, we installed 10 photovoltaic panels, and you can see them in the picture on the right-hand side. On the roof of our building, we managed to get planning permission to do this. And they reduced our emissions by 1.7 tonnes of carbon equivalent a year, which was quite a small percentage, about 4% of our emissions at the time. There was a cost, obviously, to do this, and it's basically paid for itself over about a 12-year period. So it's become a kind of cost-neutral activity by now, because we do generate a little bit of income from generating power from our solar panels. We either save on the energy that we use, or we have a feed-in tariff and get money back for that as well. So that was a decision the Society took, the Royal Met Society took, to purchase solar panels as a longer-term investment, but also to reduce our carbon emissions back in 2012. Let's move forward a little bit in time. In 2018, we introduced a more governance structure around net zero. So we brought net zero into our strategic plan at the Royal Met Society. It became a cross-cutting theme for us. So it made sure we looked at how we could become net zero across everything that we do. We also got buy-in from trustees and ownership at that kind of trustee level. So we have one or maybe two of our trustees who wear the kind of net zero hat to question, what we do and why we do things. We also looked at our investments. So similar to the EMS, we have a reserve of money that we keep for, if needed, to support us through kind of times when we can't generate as much income. And the Society takes that reserve and invests it. And so we reviewed our investment portfolio. And at the time in 2018, we made a conscious decision not to invest in fossil fuel companies and to divest from any that we were investing in. And so that was something that we took action on about 7 years ago now. The year after, we started collecting carbon emission data, really just for scope 1 and 2 initially. We moved to a 100% renewable energy supplier, which would take our scope 2 emissions effectively down to 0. But we still had a gas boiler, and we were generating about 10 tonnes of carbon equivalent each year from our gas boiler to heat the building here in Reading. In 2021, we made a pledge to become net zero, and I'm going to talk to you about the EMS's pledge, but I think it's important that that statement is made and the actions and the transition plan are put in place in order to meet that pledge. And this then became fully embedded in the Royal Met Society strategic plan, so we can review progress and make changes to make sure we meet that pledge. And the pledge is shown in the box at the right-hand side of the slide. So we split our pledge into two, and we said that we would become net zero, focusing on just scopes 1 and 2, those kind of emissions that we have an opportunity ourselves to make decisions to reduce. And we would reduce those to net zero by 2025, so this year. And we would work towards net zero emissions for scope 3, or the other external emissions, by 2030. But we said we'd do that subject to feasibility assessment. So we wanted to make sure what we did was going to get us to net zero, but not damage the business itself. So we've been completing those feasibility studies in the last few years. So in 2022, we set our baseline year for scopes 1 and 2. We managed to capture all that data. We were happy enough with the data we had, so we captured this as our baseline year. We decided we wanted to have that data certified or verified by an independent organisation. The organisation we went with was called Planet Mark, because we felt as an environmental organisation, if we were going to talk about this data, I would be more comfortable having that independently validated. So we did that. Also in 2022, we removed our gas boiler. It had come to the end of its life, and rather than replace it with another gas boiler, we removed it, and now our heating system in the building runs off our 100% renewable energy tariff. So that effectively took my scope 1 down to 0. So if you remember, the first part of my pledge was to get scope 1 and 2 to net zero by 2025. By making that change with the gas boiler, I've effectively achieved that a few years early. In 2023, we started reporting those annual emissions for scopes 1 and 2, and started to delve into the scope 3 emission data, which was much more challenging to pull together. On the right-hand side, you can see a breakdown of our scope 3 emissions at the Royal Meteorological Society, totaling roughly 290 tonnes. And you can see the breakdown across the different categories. As I showed on a previous slide, there are 15 different categories, of which we contribute to, I think, 7 or 8 of them. So not all of them, but quite a few of them. In 2024, so last year, we started doing feasibility studies to see if it was really possible to get us to net zero fully across all the scopes by 2030. We completed our transition plan. And we did a bit of work, which I'll talk about on the next slide, about actually comparing the structure within which you report these emissions against the programs of work that we do. And the next slide, I think, explains that a little better. So for scope 3, we have around about 290 tonnes of carbon equivalent that we emit each year. And if I just focus on the activities of the Royal Met Society, there are 3 activities that make up 90% of those emissions, those 290 tonnes emissions. So three activities that we do make up pretty much the majority of the emissions. And they are our scientific publishing, which is about 45%, our investment portfolio, which is about 25%, and the events that we run, which is roughly 19%. If we can break it up to look at it in a slightly different way, so instead of just looking at the activities, I can break it down into the greenhouse gas protocol categories, these 15 categories that I've just mentioned. And you can see that category 1 is probably the dominant category that we need to focus on. It's about 64% of the scope 3 emissions. But we found that one supplier made up the majority of the category 1 emissions, and that again comes back to our scientific publisher. So we have a supplier called Wiley who do our scientific publishing for us. So whichever way I kind of cut and look at the emission data, I end up back really at the same kind of problem in that a small number of our activities or suppliers effectively lead to the greatest amount of my Scope 3 emissions. And so the society has tended to move to look at the activity-based focus, so the top of this slide, rather than the greenhouse gas categories, which we just find a little bit more complicated to kind of get our head around. So I'm going to take you through those 3 activities and what we've been doing to try and reduce, or to do the feasibility studies as to whether we can reduce to net zero. And so that started with engagement with the suppliers, the publishers, our investors, and the venues that we run our events at. And our publisher Wiley, so they have a target to become net zero by 2040. So we're on a target of 2030. They're 10 years later than us. But they are working with us so they can support our 2030 target. And we found out last month they've completed a feasibility study internally that they believe they can achieve our 2030 target. They will use us as a test of that, and then they will roll out all of these initiatives across their organizations so that they can meet their 2040 target. So they've been very receptive to this. We've agreed this will be included in our contract with Wiley, so it's a contractual agreement, which I think is really important for us, and I think for them as well. So we will be, hopefully, we will have net zero journals by 2030, which we also feel will be a useful marketing and publicity activity for the society in promoting its scientific publishing. Investments. So we have been receiving carbon emission data from our investors for a few years now, but I just get one number each year, and I don't have a feel for how that breaks down across our investment portfolio. So last year we asked if we could go to, it's called direct investments, but it basically allows me to see each of the companies that we invest in and the carbon emissions that are related to those. So we can make decisions on which companies we want to continue investing in and which ones we want to divest from. And we made some changes to our portfolio last year and saw a 25% reduction in our carbon emissions against our investments, while still seeing growth in the investment portfolio. So it wasn't a detrimental impact to our investments. And we'll continue to do that year on year. And then finally, just talking about events. So we host around about 50 events each year. They are a mixture of in-person events where we have a venue and delegates come to the event itself. And we have a number of virtual events, purely online, a little bit like this webinar series. So roughly a 40-60 split of in-person to fully virtual events. Obviously, with the in-person events, we have venues and catering, and those generate emissions, so we need to collect that information. And we also have delegates traveling to our events, our in-person events, and we've been collecting delegate information, travel information for about 4 years now. And we found, that's given us a good idea of the impact, I guess, our delegates have on attending our events. But it is worth saying here, and I'll say this again when we come to the EMS emission data, that the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't require, it's not mandatory to include the delegate emission data in our Royal Met Society carbon emissions. And the rationale for that is that many of the delegates that attend our events will also report their emission data back with their organisation or university that they come from. And so instead of having double accounting, so it's accounted for by the Royal Met Society and the individual's organisation, we, as the host of the event, don't have to report that as part of our emission data. However, and I think similar with the EMS, we believe being transparent, reporting that data, letting people know what that impact actually has on delegates coming to our in-person events, and encouraging them to consider sustainable ways of traveling to our events is a better approach than just ignoring it completely. There's a website link at the bottom of that slide if you wanted to find out more about our events, activities, and work towards net zero. But on the right-hand side, I wanted to share a post from one of our delegates that attended a conference that we were hosting in Manchester, in the northwest of England. So you can see on their post, there's a map, and you can see Manchester up here. And these two delegates cycled all the way from Exeter, you can see in the southwest of England, all the way up to Manchester and back again after the event. So these are the kind of community around us are driving the Royal Met Society, as I believe we'll have the same with the EMS. They're driving us to make this change. They want us to, push this journey towards net zero, to make these changes. So in a sense, that's much more helpful to have the support of the community around us. So I hope that case study is helpful in giving you a flavour of how this kind of comes to life in the real world around a Met Society. But I'm going to return now to the EMS and look at the scopes again for the EMS, because it is different. The EMS is a different organisation to the Royal Met Society. So I return to this slide, but now I've added some red stars where you can see where the activities of the EMS are generating electricity. So the EMS doesn't have a building, it doesn't own a building, so there aren't any direct company facilities or fleet cars or company vehicles. We don't do any chemical processing that generate carbon emissions. And my understanding, the contract that we have for the leased building that we use also includes the electricity. So scopes 1 and 2, effectively, we don't have any for the EMS. What we do have is what we call a leased asset. So we lease a building for our staff to work from. And again, that captures both space, the impact of the emissions from that organisation that we lease from. And we can capture some of that data. That is quite challenging, but it is quite small as well anyway. We also can capture the employee commuting data. So again, that's something we will look to do in the coming years, is to look at how much emissions come from our small team commuting to the office. The remainder, business travel, waste, fuel, purchased goods and services, and transportation and distribution, all effectively linked to the annual meeting that we run every year. And that moves around Europe. And it also changes in size and scale, but that is by far the biggest contribution for our carbon emissions, that one activity that we do each year. So I'm going to focus on that, and I'll group them together, but it will include things like waste, the venue itself, which comes under purchased goods and services, the catering. So I'll break this down, and we'll also look at the impact of delegate travel as well. So we've been collecting data for the last couple of years, and the last 2 annual meetings were in Bratislava in 2023 and Barcelona in 2024. And we have been capturing data for the event. So the top line you'll see here is for the event emissions, but excludes delegate travel for now. So the event emissions without delegates includes the venue, so an estimate of the space that we use for our conference, for our annual meeting, the electricity that we used, the water that was consumed, the waste that we generated, transporting any event material to the venue, that's also included, and catering. And catering is actually quite a significant part of both of these figures that you can see here. It's about 2/3 roughly, despite us moving to catering meals and snacks that are vegan and vegetarian to try and kind of limit the emissions from the catering that we offer. So depending on the size of the venue, on the number of delegates that come, so you can see in Bratislava we had 523 delegates, and in Barcelona we nearly reached 1,000 in-person delegates. A much bigger event in Barcelona, you would expect the emissions to be bigger, greater because of that. So that's going to be a challenge for the EMS. If it wants to grow its annual meeting and grow the number of delegates coming to the annual meeting, clearly we're going to see growth in emissions alongside that. So we're going to have to work a bit harder to get those numbers down. But I also wanted to share with you the delegate, when we wrap in the information from delegate travel. So you can see these numbers are much bigger. The biggest impact from our emissions data is delegates travelling to our events. And as I mentioned a minute ago, under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it isn't mandatory to include this data within our emissions, our annual emissions submission data. We don't need to do that, but we plan on being transparent about this because it is such a significant part. We want to share this information. And we have a breakdown of the how delegates travel to our annual meeting, whether that's by airplane or train, using public transport, the local way people get around, whether that's using taxis or cars, for example. So we can capture that data, but what we want to do is to encourage our delegates to consider more sustainable ways to travel to our annual meeting. That's really the approach here. It's about encouraging people rather than making changes that actually restrict people from not being able to travel to our annual meeting. And we have an EMS sustainable meetings policy, and you can see at the bottom of this slide, I refer to this. We've had this since 2015, so we've been considering this for the last 10 years. We see this as an important part of the EMS. We know that our annual meeting is by far the biggest contributor to our data carbon emissions. And so we introduced this sustainable meetings policy, which has been updated over the last 10 years, which really tries to encourage delegates. It talks about collecting this data, but it encourages delegates to think about travelling sustainably. And that's something we will continue to do as we work towards our pledge. So, as Ernesto mentioned at the beginning, we agreed that we would make a pledge to become net zero by 2040. And this was announced last September at our annual meeting in Barcelona. And as I mentioned right at the very beginning, this has been something the EMS has been discussing now for a couple of years. The General Assembly of all the Met societies across Europe have met twice to discuss about net zero and to decide on the pledge and the activities to meet this pledge. So it's something we've thought about over the last couple of years before we made this pledge. But nevertheless, we decided we would make a pledge, and we've introduced these intermediary targets. So we want to reduce our emissions by about 1/3 by 2030, and then by 2/3 by 2035. So we've basically got a linear decrease between now and 2040. And we'll use 2023 as our baseline year. So the data we collected, including the event in Bratislava, will be classed as our baseline year to work against these reductions that we're setting. In addition to making the pledge, we produced a transition plan. And I've shown you a timeline of how the activities within that transition plan as we move towards our target of net zero at the bottom of this table. So last year we made the pledge, we decided we wanted to make this commitment, and we communicated that, we announced this at our annual meeting. It was our 25th anniversary, and we felt it was a real appropriate time to make this pledge and this commitment to become net zero. We reviewed our sustainable travel policy, which is again all about encouraging people to use sustainable transportation when traveling to our events. So again, we want to encourage people to make those decisions when coming to the EMS events, and that's now been implemented this year. We've integrated net zero into our strategic plan. So I attended the latest strategic monitoring group a few weeks ago. So we've embedded this as part of our governance of EMS, so we can keep a track of our progress against it and make decisions to drive us towards this net zero target. We are reporting our annual emissions in our annual report, and we'll do that for 2024 in the annual report that's, I think, ready to be published now. We'll become a signatory of Pledge to Net Zero. So this is an organisation that pulls together people who are on a similar journey to share their pledge, to share their annual emissions data and activities towards becoming net zero. And that's something the Royal Met Society has done, and I think it's been very useful in sharing ideas and best practice. So again, I think this would be sensible for the EMS to join this initiative as well. I said I would run an EMS webinar on net zero, and here I am. So tick, that one is done as well. And we'll continue this year with stakeholder collaboration. And I think for me, this is really important. The EMS community is made up of scientists who work in the field of meteorology, and that includes net zero. And so really, we ought to be able to draw on people and experts across our own community to help us on this journey to get to net zero. So it's a call really for anybody on this webinar or who listens to the recording in slower time. If you're interested in supporting the EMS to get to net zero, then please do contact us so we can work out how we can use your knowledge and expertise to help us. And then in future years, you can see a list of some of the activities, some of the policies and practices that we wish to introduce. We'll look at the offsetting policy, and I think I focused on this one because I think this is important. You know, we could offset all of our emissions now and not try and reduce our emissions through our activities. And, you know, again, to me, that wouldn't solve the climate change issue. So one of the key things before we do any offsetting is to make our reductions as small as possible and then consider how we offset the emissions that are left over, the challenging bit that really it becomes very hard to eliminate. And so we'll look at that offsetting policy, and I'm hoping by 2030 there'll be some useful mechanisms out there that we can align ourselves with. We do publish a journal. We've just launched our GEMS journal, the Journal of the EMS, last year. So we will look at sustainable publishing. Again, we'll work with our publisher, which is Elsevier, to do that. And again, I've set some actions for that in future years as well. But ultimately, all of these things take us towards those intermediary targets of reducing by about 1/3 by 2030, by 2/3 by 2035, and effectively becoming net zero by 2040. And I'm going to close there because I'd like to leave time to take some questions from people on the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for guiding us in this travel to net zero. And now we move to questions. Please write your questions in the chat. Please, Vesna, can you proceed with the questions appearing in the chat?
Yes, thank you, Ernesto. We have one question actually from you, and I would make the same question. Liz, what are the challenges of collecting emissions data for the EMS?
Yeah, so challenges not just for the EMS, I think for many organizations. As you saw in my presentation, the way we report the emission data under the 3 different scopes makes it very challenging to work out exactly which activities of the EMS produce which emissions. A lot of the methodology that's used is based on cost. That's probably the most simple way of working out or estimating what the emission is against an activity, is to look at the cost of that activity. But in reality, you want to try and get to look at the actual emissions. So not based on an estimate of cost, but actually on the activity itself, because that's the most realistic one. And that's where it becomes quite challenging. So my advice to the EMS, to any other organization who are looking to capture emissions, is to not overcomplicate things. If you can look at estimates of cost, that's the most simple way to get started, because you should know the cost of things, you get invoiced for things, so you can start to convert that into an equivalent carbon emission. But I would also suggest that you focus on the the biggest activities that contribute to your carbon emissions. And that is quite easy to work out. So you should quite quickly be able to, we know for the EMS, our biggest contributor is the annual meeting. And particularly if we focus on the delegates attending our meeting, it's their travel emissions. And that's where I think we have an opportunity to make some big changes. So for example, waste at the EMS, waste at the Royal Met Society is quite small. And I could spend months trying to get actual data of our waste emissions. And I don't really gain anything because it's a very small number. And I can try and reduce my waste, but it's not going to make it's not going to make a big impact on my overarching number. So I have parked that for now. I've captured an estimate, realize it's small, and I'm going to leave that for now. And I'm just going to focus on the big activities that I can make some significant headway. So it's more about prioritizing. It's about using simpler methods if you can, so using cost to make those estimates, and also trying to just focus on the big activities and not spending too much time on the very small activities, because you don't get any value back from that.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. Could it be relevant in the near future, the geographical location in the selection of host country for the EMS annual meeting in order to minimize emissions from transportation? Because transportation is quite a big amount.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, so let's be clear, the EMS is not planning on changing its current strategy, which is to move the annual meeting around Europe. So each of our member societies gets an opportunity to host the annual meeting. There is no plan to change that structure. But you raise a valid point, Ernesto, in clearly, if we did choose a more central location in Europe that was easily accessible by the train networks across Europe, for example, then that potentially could have a positive impact on reducing our carbon footprint from delegate travel. However, I don't believe we need to consider that at this stage. It might be something we have to look at as we get closer to 2040, but for now, that's not the plan of the EMS. What we want to do is to ask delegates to think about sustainable travel to the venues that we have. So in Barcelona, I came from the UK. I could have quite easily and quickly jumped on a flight from London to Barcelona. I could have been there in a couple of hours, but my carbon footprint would have been significant. Instead, I took the train from Reading to Barcelona. It took me 24 hours to get there, but it was a pleasant journey. I made the journey into an opportunity, I guess, and I could work while I was traveling, so it wasn't all time off work. That's not possible for everybody across Europe. We have members from places like Iceland or some of the Greek islands. It's very hard to get from Scandinavia down to some parts of Southern Europe, for example. So it's not going to be possible for everybody to be fully sustainable. But many of our delegates have a choice, and we want to encourage them to at least consider that when they're traveling to our annual meeting.
Okay, do you know, does the EMS plan on integrating climate science and meteorological expertise into its net zero strategy?
Yes. So I guess there's two responses to this question. The first is, I mentioned in my talk, we have experts from across Europe that engage with the EMS, are part of the member societies across Europe, working in this field, this important field. We need to draw on that expertise to help us get to net zero. So I think that's one, and again, a call, I think, to anybody who's watching the webinar or watching the recording. If you're interested in helping us to get to net zero, and particularly if you have an expertise in certain areas of this, then please do help us. But all of the activities have to have a kind of science-based focus. We need to make sure the methodology that we use, the policies that we introduce, the solutions that we put forward are science-based. So the science is front and center to helping us to get to net zero, whether it's the people who can help us with their expertise or following the science that exists.
Okay, in addition to collecting data and implementing carbon offsetting, how do you see stimulating carbon advocacy using EMS web meetings, activities, etc., to promote climate action within the meteorological community?
Yeah, so again, we've been collecting the data now for 2 years. We report that in our annual report, and I think it would be good to share that data more visibly, I guess, on the website. I think that's something we should look to do. But alongside my previous 2 answers, it's about educating people. So I think the EMS not only has a role in reducing its own carbon emissions and getting to net zero, but it's about educating others on the impact that they have, on the actions that they can take. We can use our EMS website and our meetings to share and educate information and ideas and policies that we introduce at the EMS. We're more than happy to share those as widely as possible across the meteorological community. So I think the EMS would like to see themselves taking a leadership role here, and I think there's an opportunity to do that. We can draw on the expertise of the community, but we can also share our best practice and our knowledge back to those across the community as well. But I think, the more we can talk about this, and I think this webinar today is a nice example of how we can do that, the more we can share and, educate people, share our own journey with those around us. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be good to come back to this webinar series in a couple of years' time, maybe, and see how well we're progressing.
Okay.
How do you collect the data from delegates?
Oh, good question. So we have an online form where we ask them to let us know where they've come from and what mode of travel they've used. And again, we do the same at the Royal Met Society. I think we don't get everybody completing our form for the Royal Met Society, but it gives us a good estimate on how people are travelling to events. So the same using data. So we ask delegates travelling how they got here and where they've come from.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before closing this webinar, this event, allow me once more to remind you, sorry for being so insistent, our request to send to us proposals of topics and speakers for future webinars. And finally, let me thank you all for your attendance, and special thanks to our today's invited speaker, Liz Bentley. The next webinar is scheduled for 16th of April, 1 week. And this webinar will be about the rapidly attributing extreme weather events.